Open up! Open up! The words split the night like gunfire. Maria Alvarez's heart gave one sudden hard thud. A second later came the thumping boots, the slam of fists, and then, crack, the door shuddered on its hinges. Before she could tighten the blanket around her shoulders, the frame splintered and the door flew inward. Floodlights, barked orders, the smell of sweat and leather. 6 officers poured into her living room, led by Chief Inspector Blake, whose voice filled the house as though it were his personal theater. Outside, a ripple of excitement passed through the street. Windows slid open. Doors creaked wide. Neighbors leaned out, phones already glowing in their hands, live streams flashing on, faces eager for spectacle. The lonely widow at number 14 was finally caught. Maria stood in the center of her dim little room, wrapped in a faded blanket that reached her ankles. Her bare feet pressed against the floorboards worn smooth from decades of pacing. Her hair, gray and thin, was pulled back into a bun, wisps escaping to halo her face. She didn't speak. She didn't move. One officer swept his flashlight across the sagging sofa, the leaning bookcase, the shelf cluttered with chipped mugs and old photo frames. His lip curled. "A dump like this," he sneered, "definitely hiding filth." The words earned a chuckle from the others. The neighbors outside jeered, their voices carrying into the small room. Chief Blake entered last, his broad shoulders filling the doorway. His uniform was immaculate, boots, polished to mirror brightness, cap angled to perfection. His jaw was square, the sort meant to broadcast authority. But the little tick at the corner of his mouth, the quick flick of his eyes toward the phones outside, betrayed what fueled him most: performance. He loved the stage. Tonight, Maria was his prop. He spat to the side, deliberately loud. "Probably tied to junkies." The insult rang out, bouncing off the peeling wallpaper. Neighbors gasped and laughed in delight, already typing captions for their streams. Maria did not flinch. She simply stood, fingers tight around her blanket, dark eyes steady on Blake. The flashlight beam swung across the wall, and the room shifted. Metal glinted, a plaque, darkened with age, its edges sharp and proud. The engraved letters caught the light. Maria's voice came then, low and calm. "That belonged to my husband, General Eduardo Alvarez." The words landed like a weight. For a moment, no one moved. Then Blake barked a laugh, sharp and mocking. "Sure it did. Pawn shop trash." His men followed his lead, laughing, eager to mirror their commander. But one officer, leaner than the rest, younger, kept his flashlight steady on the plaque. His brows knit together. His mouth didn't join the chorus of laughter. Maria's face softened for half a second as her eyes flicked toward him. Then she straightened again, silence pressing against the insults. "Search everything," Blake commanded. His voice boomed like a gavel. "Tear this place apart." And so they did. Closets were flung open, clothing yanked out and tossed into piles on the floor. An officer held up a faded shawl and twirled it mockingly before letting it drop in the dust. "What's this? Your high society wardrobe?" The neighbors roared with laughter. Maria's eyes locked on the shawl. For the first time, her lips moved with purpose. "Pick it up." The officer froze. Something in her voice, quiet but cutting, made him hesitate. He left the shawl where it lay, and the others jeered at him until he forced a grin and turned away. Another officer kicked a chair onto its side. "Who lives like this?" The blanket shifted against Maria's chest as her grip tightened. She didn't answer. Drawers banged open, their contents flung wide. An old journal fell to the ground, its spine cracked, pages skittering across the floor like leaves in a storm. "That was my husband's," she said. Her words were stones dropped into a lake. No ripple of emotion, just the weight of truth. The officers ignored her. A loose floorboard groaned under one man's boot. He crouched and pried it up with a triumphant grin, expecting treasure or contraband. Dust swirled up. The cavity was empty. He barked a laugh. "What are you hiding? Riches under the floor?" The others laughed with him. Maria stepped forward and pressed the board back down with her bare foot. The laughter faltered. Her eyes held theirs, unblinking. On the side table, a photo frame had toppled in the chaos. A younger Maria smiled from behind the glass, her arm hooked through Eduardo's, his military uniform sharp and proud. One officer picked it up, studied it, smirked. "Who's this supposed to be?" "Your imaginary general?" He tossed it back, careless. Maria bent and lifted the frame gently, brushing the dust away. Her fingers lingered on Eduardo's face before she set it upright again. Blake's voice cut through. "Got anything to say for yourself, or just gonna stand there like a ghost?" Maria met his eyes. "That plaque is real." "Fake," he shot back instantly, but his voice cracked just slightly. The rage stretched into hours. The house groaned under the assault. Every drawer emptied, every cushion slashed open, pots banged against tile, papers tore, laughter scraped against the walls. The neighbors outside shifted between jeers and gasps, their commentary feeding the endless stream of live videos. A woman in a pink robe leaned into her phone camera, whispering like a news anchor. "She's always been odd. Now you see why." Another, sipping beer from a can, shouted toward the door, "Steal from us, will you?" Though Maria had never taken so much as a cup of sugar without asking. Inside, the insults grew bolder. "Where's the jewelry, Grandma?" "Maybe she eats the cash. Look at this fridge." The refrigerator door swung wide, its shelves bare save for a jar of pickles and leftovers wrapped in foil. The officer slammed it shut with disgust. Maria's hands trembled, just slightly, where they gripped her blanket. She remembered when that fridge had been full. Eduardo's homecomings, steaks sizzling, laughter filling the kitchen, the sound of his boots by the door. She closed her eyes for half a heartbeat, and the memory was there. Eduardo kissing her forehead before leaving for his final mission, promising he'd return. When she opened her eyes, the fridge was empty again. The house was filled not with laughter, but with jeers. One officer rifled through a drawer and pulled out an envelope, its paper yellowed but the seal intact. His brow furrowed. The crest stamped on the wax was unmistakable, a military insignia. "Sir," he said, his voice quieter than the others, This looks official." Blake snatched it, tore it open, and scanned the letter. His face reddened. "Fake!" he barked, crumpling it in his fist. But the tremor in his hand betrayed him. Maria's voice slipped into the tension. "Read the rest." The young officer leaned closer. "It's from the Pentagon, addressed to her." Silence rippled across the room. For a moment, only the sound of neighbors muttering outside filled the air. Blake snarled and hurled the letter to the ground. "Counterfeit," he roared. "Don't let her fool you." But his men shifted uneasily, their eyes flicking from the crumpled letter to the plaque on the wall. Maria bent, gathered the letter carefully, smoothed its wrinkles, and set it atop the side table beneath Eduardo's photo. Her silence pressed heavier than any shout could. The search pushed deeper. The house became a storm of boots and shouts, every drawer a battlefield, every cupboard a casualty. Dust swirled in golden clouds as flashlights darted across cracked walls and broken furniture. Then came the clatter. A small wooden case tumbled from the top shelf of the bedroom closet, splitting open when it hit the floor. Silence fell. Out spilled rows of medals, dull with age but unmistakably real. Bronze, silver, a star glimmering faintly, each etched with a name that had once commanded respect: General Eduardo Alvarez. The wiry young officer knelt, his flashlight steady, his throat tightened. These are real," he whispered. His words weren't for Blake, or Maria, or even himself. They were the kind of words that spill out when denial can no longer hold. Maria bent slowly with a grace that quieted even the sneers outside. She gathered the medals in both hands, treating them as though they were glass. Her blanket slipped slightly from her shoulder, revealing a scar along her collarbone. Faint, old, but jagged. One officer cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. "Could be replicas," he muttered, though no conviction laced the words. Blake's face darkened. "Replicas exactly." His voice was hard, but his eyes flicked toward the phones, still recording at the door. He needed certainty. He needed dominance. Maria set the medals carefully back into the box. Her lips didn't move, but her silence was no longer passive. It was suffocating, pressing in on every man in the room. Another officer yanked open a drawer beneath the bed and pulled free a slim bundle of letters, tied with frayed ribbon. He scoffed and untied it, flipping one open. His voice faltered. "This is signed by the Secretary of Defense. Commendations." Blake ripped the letter from his hand. His fingers trembled as he read. The lines were authentic, so authentic they burned. "Forgery," he snapped, the word tumbling too fast, too sharp. The wiry officer's jaw set. "Sir, with respect, I don't think so." The air shifted. The laughter that had carried the raid so far was gone. The neighbors outside grew restless, some retreating from their cameras, others whispering uneasily. Maria stepped toward the side table. With measured calm, she placed the metal case atop the crumpled pentagon letter, aligning them neatly. The photo of Eduardo stood watch above it all. Then, without raising her voice, she said, "You've recorded everything." The officers stiffened. Maria reached for the small tape recorder on the shelf. Her thumb pressed play. The room filled with sound, their voices captured clearly. "Lonely old woman, tied to junkies. Who lives like this? Maybe she eats the cash." Each insult looped back through the walls, echoing, undeniable. Neighbors froze, their earlier laughter now replayed as evidence of cruelty. Faces blanched, phones lowered. The digital mob felt, for the first time, the cold sting of accountability. Maria pressed stop. The silence that followed was louder than any scream. She plugged the recorder into her phone. A single tap, and the file shot outward, sent to news outlets, to contacts, to the void where truth travels faster than lies. Her blanket slipped further, revealing the steady rise and fall of her chest. Her silence was a blade, and it had just been unsheathed. Blake's fist balled. "You think anyone cares about the past?" he spat. "The world moves on. You're nothing now." Maria's gaze didn't waver. She looked at him as though she could see the cracks beneath his uniform, the desperation hidden behind his bark. By morning, the storm had shifted. The headlines arrived first, splashed across glowing screens. "Police raid widow of decorated general." Insults, jeers, humiliation caught on tape. "Who is Maria Alvarez?" Clips of the raid flooded the internet. Neighbors' mocking faces froze in unflattering frames. Officers' sneers replayed endlessly. The sound bites, probably tied to junkies, became rallying cries against the department. Maria stayed home. She didn't need to chase the news. The news had come to her. Cameras gathered outside, but this time the reporters weren't jeering. They were reverent, cautious, voices lowered as though entering sacred ground. Inside, Maria moved slowly, picking up toppled chairs, smoothing torn pages, refolding her shawl. The house bore scars from the raid, but so did she, and neither would be erased in a day. Blake sat in his office with his head in his hands. The commissioner's voice still rang in his ears. "Suspended pending investigation." His phone buzzed nonstop. Messages of disgust, threats, mockery. Sponsors withdrew from community events tied to his name. His kids' school sent polite but firm requests for a low profile. His wife wouldn't look at him. The officers who had laughed beside him distanced themselves instantly. The wiry young one, in contrast, had been interviewed on live television. His words were clipped, professional. "I regret not speaking sooner. Mrs. Alvarez deserved better." Each sentence drove Blake deeper into the shadows of disgrace. The neighbors, too, felt the backlash. Their live streams, once a badge of petty triumph, now became evidence of cruelty. Employers called them in. Friends avoided them. At the grocery store, strangers whispered. One woman, whose face had been captured laughing as Maria's shawl hit the floor, returned home to find her windows scrawled with chalk. "Coward." Maria didn't gloat. She moved through her home like a shadow, dusting Eduardo's medals, straightening his photo, placing the plaque back on the wall. But Blake couldn't let go. That night, drunk and disheveled, he stumbled up Maria's walkway. His uniform was gone, replaced by a cheap jacket that reeked of whiskey. His fists pounded the new plywood that covered her broken door. "Nobody respects you," he slurred. "You're just living off your dead husband's shadow. You'll die alone." Neighbors peeked from windows but didn't dare step outside. The live streams had stopped. The ridicule now carried too high a price. Maria opened the door slowly. She stood framed in the dim light, her blanket draped around her shoulders, her face pale but unyielding. Behind Blake, whispers carried through the street. The crowd wanted him gone, but fear and shame kept them rooted. Blake spat on the step. You think this makes you powerful? You're nothing. Nothing but a widow drowning in dust. Maria didn't answer. Her silence was colder than steel, sharper than glass. For the first time, Blake wavered. Not from alcohol, but from the realization that nothing he said could dent her. The days that followed blurred into something surreal. Maria's home, once ignored and mocked, became a landmark. Reporters lingered by the gate, but with a reverence that surprised even them. They lowered their voices when they spoke her name, as though she were already etched into the nation's conscience. Maria tolerated their presence with the same silence she had carried through the raid. She spoke only once, when a young journalist, barely 20, earnest and trembling, asked if she had anything she wanted the world to know. She looked past the girl, past the cameras to the horizon. Then slowly she said, "My husband fought to protect a country that now forgets it's dead. Do not forget again," that was all. The clip went viral. Her voice, measured, low, yet filled with unshakable weight, struck chords that no shouting ever could. Memes turned her into an emblem, the silence that spoke. Schools replayed her words during assemblies. Universities analyzed her poise as if she were part of a leadership course. Politicians tried, clumsily, to align themselves with her dignity, but Maria wanted no politics. Her days were simple: tidying Eduardo's medals, brewing tea, writing letters in the careful, looping script of her youth. The house smelled faintly of chamomile and dust. The quiet now pierced less by cruelty than by curiosity. Still, shadows lingered. Blake had not disappeared. Suspended, shunned, stripped of his badge, he haunted the edges of the story. Sometimes Maria glimpsed him across the street, face unshaven, eyes burning from under a hood. Neighbors no longer greeted him. His children no longer walked with him. His wife had filed papers. He was unmoored, adrift in a world that had moved on without him. And in the silence Maria wielded like a blade, he saw the reflection of his own collapse. The younger officer, the wiry one who had dared doubt Blake, visited Maria one afternoon. He stood awkwardly at her door, hands bare, no uniform now but a simple shirt and slacks. "I wanted to apologize," he said, his voice cracked with sincerity. "I didn't stop it." "I should have." Maria studied him for a long moment. She noted the way his shoulders sagged, the way his gaze didn't flinch. Finally, she stepped aside and let him in. He sat at her table, sipping tea nervously as his words tumbled out, about the force, about corruption, about fear of speaking against superiors. His confession was less about excuses and more about purging. Maria listened. When he finished, she placed her hand lightly over Eduardo's metal box. "You are young," she said softly. "Do not waste your years in silence." The officer nodded, throat tight. When he left, Maria returned to her shawl and her letters. She had no illusions. One apology did not rewrite history, but it planted something, a seed. Meanwhile, Blake spiraled. At first, his rage was public. He stormed city council meetings, shouting that the media had twisted everything. He harassed reporters on the street, hurling accusations of bias. He flooded online forums with bitter posts, defending his name. But when the responses turned crueler, mocking him with clips of his own sneers, his fury collapsed inward. He stopped shaving. He stopped appearing in daylight. He sold his truck to pay rent. And late at night, he watched the viral videos of Maria again and again, the silence replayed, each time cutting deeper. What haunted him most wasn't her defiance. It was the emptiness, the fact that she hadn't needed words to unmake him. Autumn deepened. The air grew sharp with the scent of wood smoke, the leaves crisp beneath tired shoes. Maria spent her mornings sweeping the porch, her afternoons writing. The world moved around her, yet she remained steady, an anchor in a storm others had chosen. But Blake was unraveling. He began drinking earlier, muttering to himself in alleyways. He returned to Maria's house again, not with fists this time, but with whispers that seeped through her window at night. "You think you're better than me. You think silence makes you strong. You're nothing without that dead man. Neighbors heard him but turned away. They wanted no part in his downfall. The mob that once mocked Maria now abandoned Blake, unwilling to stain themselves further. One evening, Maria lit a candle in her front room. Its glow flickered against Eduardo's photo. She sat, shawl around her shoulders, eyes steady on the flame. A thud rattled her porch. She didn't flinch. The door creaked open, not broken this time, but slowly, cautiously, like a thief unsure of his theft. Blake stepped in, eyes bloodshot, hands trembling. "You ruined me," he hissed. His voice cracked with desperation, not dominance. "You destroyed my life. My kids won't look at me. My wife, she left. I have nothing. Nothing because of you." Maria's gaze lifted, calm, unwavering. "You destroyed yourself," she said. The words landed like a hammer, short, sharp, undeniable. Blake staggered. He shook his head violently as though the truth could be shaken free. "No, no, you did this. Your silence. It spread like a disease. It infected everyone. It made them hate me." Maria rose slowly, her blanket falling just enough to reveal the thin scar again. She stepped toward him, each movement deliberate, unhurried. "My silence was never mine alone," she said. "It was the silence of every widow, every soldier left unremembered. You mocked it, and the world heard you." Blake's breathing quickened. His eyes darted wildly, searching for an escape from words that were no longer silent. "I won't let you end me," he muttered. His hand trembled near his jacket pocket. Maria stood taller, her shadow stretching across the room. "You already ended yourself," she whispered. The candle flickered. The air thickened. And then, his pocket empty, his threats hollow, Blake collapsed into a chair, sobbing. The sound was ugly, raw, unmasked. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders heaving. Maria did not move closer. She returned to Eduardo's photo, her back to the man unraveling behind her. Her silence reclaimed its throne. Neighbors peered from across the street, phones poised, but none dared record. This was no spectacle. It was a reckoning. By morning, Blake was gone. No one knew where. Some said he left town. Others claimed he wandered the highway, muttering to himself. Maria never asked. Winter came with an edge of steel. The trees stood bare, their branches clawing at gray skies. The city slowed beneath the weight of frost, but Maria's house remained a beacon, small, quiet, enduring. She had settled into a rhythm. Tea in the mornings, letters in the afternoon, candles at dusk. The world outside still hummed with her name, but within these walls silence reigned. It was not the silence of fear anymore. It was the silence of choice. But silence does not keep storms away. Blake returned. Weeks after his disappearance, whispers began to circulate. A man seen in back alleys, gaunt, muttering, a shadow lingering near Maria's street. By the time he stood again on her porch, the neighbors no longer reached for their phones. They reached for curtains, pulling them shut, fearful of what they might witness. The door rattled under his fist. "Open up," he snarled. His voice was hoarse, ragged. "You think you've won? You think the world loves you? They'll forget you like they forgot him." Maria rose slowly from her chair. Her blanket fell across her shoulders like armor. She stepped to the door, unhurried, and opened it. Blake swayed in the cold air. His clothes hung loose, his cheeks hollow. His eyes burned, not with power now, but with the last desperate flickers of pride. "You ruined me," he spat. "I'm nothing. Nothing." Maria studied him in silence. She did not flinch. She did not tremble. "You made yourself nothing," she said finally, her voice steady, the tone of a verdict already passed. Blake lunged forward, but his strength was gone. He stumbled against the doorframe, clutching it as though it might hold him upright. His breath stank of liquor, his body of sweat and despair. "I'll," his voice cracked, "I'll make them remember me. I'll—" But the words broke apart. His knees buckled. He fell to the porch, crumpled, weeping like a child. The neighbors, drawn by the sound, opened their doors one by one. They didn't mock this time. They didn't film. They stood silent witnesses as the once feared officer lay in ruin before the widow he had tried to humiliate. Maria looked down at him. Her silence, as ever, spoke louder than any shout. She closed the door gently, leaving him to the cold. By dawn he was gone. Some said he left the city. Others whispered darker endings. But whatever the truth, Blake Alvarez was no longer part of Maria's story. Her silence had written his final chapter. Spring returned. The frost melted and flowers pushed through the soil, as if defying the weight of what had passed. Maria's house, scarred by raids and whispers, stood intact. Stronger even. The world had not forgotten. Her name lived on in classrooms, in essays, and speeches about dignity and resistance. Universities quoted her single sentence as though it were scripture. Do not forget again. The young officer visited once more, this time in uniform. He wasn't the wiry rookie anymore. He carried himself with steadiness, with conviction earned in fire. He saluted her, not as a superior, but as a teacher. Your words change me, he said. I will not waste my years in silence. Maria nodded, her blanket draped like a mantle. The neighbors, once cruel, now crossed the street with baskets of bread, with flowers for her porch. Some came with apologies, others with silence of their own. Maria accepted both. Forgiveness was not her gift to give, but she did not turn them away. At night, she lit a candle beside Eduardo's photo. Its flame danced gently, reflected in the glass of his medals. She whispered to him, not words of sorrow but of victory. They tried to bury us, she murmured, but we endured. The city outside buzzed, as it always did, with new scandals, new stories, new distractions. But beneath it all, Maria's silence remained a current no storm could erase. And so she lived, not as a victim, not as a relic, but as a witness, a woman whose quiet had unmade cruelty and reminded the world that even the smallest voice, when carried with dignity, could topple giants. The silence had spoken, and the world had listened.